I'm very honored and excited to be able to talk to the great film historian Joseph McBRIDE today. He has published biographies and critical studies of John Ford, Howard Hawks, Orson Welles, Ernst Lubitsch, Frank Capra, Billy Wilder, and most recently George Cukor, which I will ask him about towards the end of the interview. Here are a couple of his books I have from my own library. Any fellow Ramones fans out there will also appreciate that he wrote the screenplay for 1979's Rock and Roll High School. We're going to be talking about The Other Side of the Wind, which is Orson Welles' final feature that was completed and released posthumously in 2018. Mr. McBRIDE was a consultant on the restoration and also acted in the film. Much of the film is very specific to the early 1970s, and I understand that later in life, Wells was concerned the material might not be as timely or topical anymore, and he was considering re-editing it into more of a documentary or video
Mm.
essay, like F for Fake. With that in mind, do you think that he would have been pleased with the this final edit of the film that we have today?
Well, no, but I mean, Wells was very proprietary with good reason about his films. He didn't want anybody else editing his work. But I mean, he left it unfinished. It wasn't voluntary that he left it unfinished. Like some people claim he didn't care about it and he walked away from it. It's just not true. I mean, if you read his correspondence and interviews, you know that he was really desperately trying to get the rights to this film, and it became a terribly complicated financial and legal morass, and also political because he had started the film with his money and Roy Kodar's money, and but then they realized they needed more money, and they brought in partners. Unfortunately, chose an Iranian film company that was based in Paris. Mehdi Boucherie was the principal there, and he was I never met him, but apparently a good guy. But he was the Shah's brother-in-law, and so they were helping fund the film. But when the Ayatollah took over in Iran, they wanted to confiscate all the property of the royal family, and he was kind of tangentially part of the royal family. And so they actually sent a couple of guys to the office in Paris where Dominique Antoine was the, kind of the line producer of The Other Side of the Wind for Boucherie, and she was sympathetic to Wells, but these two guys wanted to confiscate the other side of the wind on behalf of the Iranian government. And she thought very quickly, and she said, "Oh, on my desk, I have a letter I just got from the French tax authorities, and there's a tax bill that you guys got to pay. So why don't you take care of that tax bill?" And they kind of looked at each other and said, "Oh, well, we'll see you later." And they took off. So she helped save the film. But that put the film in limbo. I mean, you couldn't really deal with that regime at that point. Um, and so Wells was trying and trying and trying, but he edited 40 minutes roughly of the film. And but Bob Murawski did a wonderful job, I think, of editing the film in the style that Wells set in that 40 minutes of material, which I have. And that's what Gary Graver and that was part of what we showed to potential investors. And Wells had edited parts of the party sequence and also parts of the film within the film. So he established two editing styles, which were very different. The film within the film is kind of languid and very artsy and very beautiful 35 millimeter photography, and whereas the party sequence is fast-paced, jagged editing, and it's kind of a spoof of cinema verite. Um, and So it's very contrasting styles, as Jonathan Rosenbaum pointed out. Neither style is Wells's own style, but he was mimicking two other styles, which he had fun doing. Um, but Bob edited the film, I think, quite faithfully the way Wells intended it to be. But he also told me he took the attitude that, well, we're going to make a good movie out of this, and if I have to change something to make something work, I'll do that. And they had a vast amount of footage to edit, and so he made some decisions that I didn't agree with. I believe I mentioned to you the car sex scene, which I think is the best scene in the film. They cut from 7 minutes to 4.5, and I think they really hurt that scene.
Mm.
But generally, I think it's very well put together. Oh, just to say, yes, Wells gave an interview to Bill Crone. I think it was in around 81 or 82. And that's when he said, I'm thinking of putting it together as a film like F for Fake, or, a documentary or essay film is what he called F for Fake. And he was concerned that it was out of date. If the film had come out in 73, 74, whatever, if it had gone smoothly, it would have been very timely. And I was concerned at the time that the editing was so fast, and nobody was really editing that fast at the time. Would the audience be able to keep up with this pace? This was very daring editing. And even in 2018, when the film came out, I took some friends to see the film at the Roxy Theater in San Francisco in 35 millimeter. It didn't have a lot of theatrical showings. The producers wanted to show it in a lot of theaters, and they had a lot of theaters wanting to show it, and Netflix discouraged a lot of the showings. I mean, something always goes wrong whenever a Wells film is released. But we saw it, and I took some friends, and one of the people there had to leave the theater. He was an older guy, and he found the editing so fast that he had vertigo or something, and he said I couldn't take the editing. So it was kind of avant-garde for even 2018. But Wells told me, I was there the night he did filming the trial, which has been released on YouTube.
Mm.
And what happened with that film was he had a 35 millimeter print of the trial, and the film had gone into public domain apparently, and he was going to do a documentary where he talked about the trial with a audience of cinephiles, and then show parts of the film and interview other people, etc. And all he ever did on it was this 90-minute talk or Q&A with people at USC. And Gary Graver filmed this. Gary told me he lined up 9 film magazines on the stage, and he had his 16 millimeter camera. He filmed the whole thing, and after one magazine ran out after 10 minutes, he'd plug into the next and keep filming. And he did a remarkable job of making it all play. There are a few shots that are a little wobblier. I mean, but of course it's handheld, but it has a lot of immediacy, and Wells is in terrific form, and the camera work is good. But Stefan Drossler of the Munich Film Museum, who had the material, put it together just by kind of splicing together all the different magazines, and offered it to German television. And he said they turned it down because it was handheld, which is kind of crazy. I mean, today the audience is well used to handheld footage. I mean, a lot
Yeah.
of TV news and everything has been handheld for a long time.
And that this is continuing today, and that's one of the reasons why you've been unable to finish some of your more recent projects.
Well, there are only 2 main projects which are unfinished. One is The Other Side of the Wind, and when I tell you that my partner in that project is the brother-in-law of the late Shah of Iran, you will understand why we are having a little legal difficulty. The other unfinished film is Don Quixote.
As Wells was waiting to go in, I was standing with him outside, and he was in a wheelchair, actually. But he said he was going to make a documentary about each of his films that had been released, and I think he had 12 features released by that time. And he loved doing F for Fake. He thought he was creating a new kind of film, and he did blaze a trail for the essay film that other documentarians like Michael Moore and Errol Morris have followed. So Wells had created a kind of a new genre. I mean, there were some precedents before that, but anyway, he told me the next one he was going to do was Lady from Shanghai, and he said it's not one of my best films, but it has the best stories. He said, so I'm going to do that next.
Mhm.
And so that's he might have done one on Other Side of the Wind where if he couldn't finish all the production, he would show certain scenes. That's kind of what he was going to do with It's All True at one point when he got back and he hadn't been able to finish the film, so he could do wraparounds. And he was such a great performer and he had this great voice, etc. And the public. The only time Wells was a commercially successful director was on the radio. He
Mhm.
was a radio star, and his radio series. Well, he did more than one. They were successful, and he was a star on the radio. And so the public knew him and liked him in that medium, which was his favorite medium. And so uh, I think his documentaries are kind of like illustrated radio in a sense.
One of the most interesting things to people about The Other Side of the Wind is its portrayal of so-called New Hollywood of the early 70s. There are characters that are apparently patterned on John Milius, Peter Bogdanovich, of course.
Mm.
There's a guy who's obviously a Robert Evans type. Some of the other characters, they don't seem to remain close counterparts, though. Like there's a character of the Baron who's presumably based on John Houseman, but in the film, he's very supportive of Hannaford. He's not feuding with him. And most importantly, the Susan Strasberg character is based on Pauline Kael. And the interesting thing there is that her character's theory about Hannaford turns out to be pretty much on the nose, whereas
Mm.
Pauline Kael's theory about Wells was fairly incredible, in my opinion. Did Wells just kind of lose interest in parodying certain people
Well, my
so
my
closely?
my view of that is that he was an artist, and he it's a roman à clay in the sense that the connections you mentioned are all kind of clear. But these characters exist apart from their models. The Baron is a marvelous performance by Tonio Selward, who's this elderly actor who Wells had seen on the stage. Like Wells had this great knowledge of performers from having seen people in plays and other things like Richard Bennett, who is great as Major Amberson. Wells had seen him as a leading man in the theater, and remembered him. And the same with Tonio Selward. And he was just a wonderful fellow to talk to. And his performance is wonderful. One thing that's interesting for me as a performer, I mean, I was not an actor until I did that film, and I haven't done a lot of acting since. But when you're acting in a film, you don't necessarily know that somebody's giving a great performance, which I found really interesting. That when I saw the film all put together, I thought, my gosh, Norman Foster gives a great performance. Antonio Selward is fantastic too, and I hadn't quite realized it because I had just seen bits and pieces and seen him and worked with him on certain scenes, but I hadn't seen all the material of these two fellows. But anyway, when Wells modeled Susan's character on Kael to some extent, he would even call her Pauline Kael on the set. You know, uh, he would make jokes about Pauline Kael and stuff. But he was an artist, and Susan's an artist. Susan was a fine actress, and so you don't just set out to kind of do a one-dimensional cartoon demolishing somebody. That wouldn't be terribly interesting. It would become boring after a while. So she becomes a much more complex, intelligent character. She's one of the most intelligent characters in the story, I believe. Some of them are kind of daft, but she's really on the ball with her
Mhm.
comments, and she is kind of nasty. And I guess Wells felt that Kael was a nasty critic who had undermined him unfairly with her false claim that Wells didn't do any writing on Citizen Kane, which is absurd. Robert Carringer, who's a late Wells scholar, did a book on the making of Kane. He did a really good investigation of all the scripts of Kane, the various script drafts that he could find, and you could find it online. It was in a journal called Critical Inquiry. And he concluded that the credits were correct and fair, that Herman Mankiewicz' first position credit and Wells' second position, it was fair. They both contributed a lot to the film. And it's interesting, when I was working with Wells on Other Side of the Wind, the scene when I'm kicked out of the car, there's a shot of me from the point of view of the car as I'm standing on the side of the road, and I look very forlorn, and the car pulls away. And I remembered that in the Amberson script, there was an indication of a shot like that where George is seen from the viewpoint of an automobile, which is his nemesis. And he becomes smaller and smaller in the background. I thought, Wells is kind of repeating that. That shot is not in Amberson's, maybe. I don't know if he ever did it or what. But I thought the thing to do would be to stand totally still and not move. It would be more poignant that way. And it's hard to do that because it was like a minute-long shot. It's hard to hold your breath and not move at all for a minute, but I did that. And I remember Jonathan Rosenbaum told me once, when he had seen just parts of the film, he said, that's the first moment in the film in which I was actually emotionally moved. You feel sorry for this schmo, who's left by the side of the road. But in the background of that shot, you see a white ranch house. And we filmed it in Benedict Canyon in Beverly Hills, right near the Beverly Hills Hotel. And the white ranch house, Wells told me when we were shooting that, he said, you see that house over there? And I said, yeah. And he said, contrary to what you've read, that's where most of Citizen Kane was written. In other words, that's the house he lived in when he was making Citizen Kane. And he did a lot of writing on the film, and he and Mankiewicz worked together for a while before Mankiewicz was sent to Victorville out in the desert so he could not have distractions. He went with John Houseman to keep an eye on him and keep him from drinking more than, I think he was rationed to two martinis every night or something like that, but he had a drinking problem. But Houseman, Wells said, Houseman certainly had a claim to have written parts of Citizen Kane too, and how come he doesn't ever assert his claim? Wells was actually pretty generous with credit. He didn't hog credit. He always said that Mankiewicz really helped a lot. I mean, there's so much of that film that Mankiewicz supplied, you can tell, because he was an old newspaper man. He knew all the stories about Hearst, and he knew Hearst. He had been to San Simeon, etc. And it is a terrific newspaper film, as Pauline Kael herself mentioned. That's one of the things that always appealed to me about the film right away, because I come from a newspaper family. My parents were newspaper reporters, and I've been a member of the press since 1960. So when Susan Strasberg needles Hannaford and asks tough questions, the one that is the toughest is the one you alluded to toward the end of the film, where she's making those insinuations about his being a closet homosexual. He slaps her at the drive-in, but she is speaking kind of the subtext of the film. And so Wells gives her some lines that are very true and very crucial to the story of the film.
The actor who plays John Dale is a guy named Robert Random. I gather from Josh Karp's book that he felt very loyal to the production, and I always felt that he's one of the guys who really could have had a career boost if the film had been released at the time. He kind of fell off the radar in the 80s. Do you know much about him, or did you work with him at all?
I never met him, never worked with him. He's good in the film. He doesn't have any dialogue. He plays John Dale, and it's as he said once to somebody I know, he said, my whole role in the film is providing silent visual accompaniment to voiceovers is the way you put it, you know. But he has a prominent role. He's kind of a dead ringer for Jim Morrison too. He has that look, you know. And he was a TV actor before that, and Wells had seen him apparently on some TV show and liked him. Wells is a big TV viewer, you know. And he saw him. He was in a Bud Boetticher film, A Time for Dying, which is a really obscure film. I don't know why, but that film didn't really come out much at the time. It may have played in a few theaters. I saw it years later, and that didn't help Random's career, but he had an important part in that film. And then he did a few things. Yeah, I mean, at the time we thought, yeah, this is going to be possibly a star-making film for Bob Random and a few other people. And sadly, it didn't happen because it didn't come out. And then he kind of drifted away from acting, and he's still around. And one thing. Jonathan Rosenbaum did well, he liked to claim that Oya Kodar had directed the car sex scene, which is not true. It took 3 years to shoot that scene in LA and France. Wells had a home in France with Oya. And obviously she had a lot to do with the scene because she's the driving force. There are three people in the scene, but she had a lot to do with it, and she may have helped conceive the scene, but Wells really directed it, and I know that from talking to Gary Graver and other people, and also when I wrote an article rebutting the claim that Oya had directed that scene, somebody I know called Bob Random and got some quotes from him, and he said, "No, I thought Orson was directing the scene." You know, I mean. Sometimes Gary told me he took Bob Random's place in the car sometimes when Bob Random was not there, and Oya would be on top of him. You know, she was semi-naked, humping away, and Gary was filming her. You know, and he said that's one of the sacrifices I made for the film. He liked to make jokes about that kind of thing. There was some scene, I'm trying to remember which one, where he had to take his clothes off to do it. So I think he doubled Bob Random in this scene where Oya's pumping him on the Bear Springs, what do you call it, on that bed outside in the theater, in the studio, where Bob Random's character walks off the set when Houston Hannaford is being cruel to him. Gary had to double Random for a while naked, and Gary said, "Oh, Orson, please don't make me do that in front of my crew." You know, he said most of his crew were young women at that point, and he was embarrassed to be naked, and Orson just, you know, bullied him into doing it. But Bob Random was not always there when they did that sequence. I don't think he was in France, and a lot of it was shot in Wells's driveway of the rented house that he had where we started shooting. And they put a kind of a tarpaulin thing around the car, I believe, and they had to make rain with hoses. And there was a guy who was a friend of Gary's who was in a wheelchair. And he was living in a wheelchair. And he was the guy who played the lights of the incoming cars. He would be holding a light and kind of wheeling himself around the car, etc. Really kind of a tour de force of wonderful filmmaking. It looks like it's shot in a car that's being driven fast on a freeway with trucks and cars whizzing past in the rain, Gary shot that stuff in France, the exteriors, you know, process shots. Anyway, but yeah. Bob Random. Yeah, but poor Bob Random didn't become a star. He should have.
But I think I should emphasize now that the picture we're going to make is not the story of a bull or the story of a bullfighter. It has this world of brave fighting bulls and bullfighters as its background.
You had previously mentioned to me that there was originally going to be some bullfighting material in the film right up until the last minute.
Mm-hmm.
Do you happen to know if that was going to be Hannaford and his crew just going as spectators, or was it supposed to be part of the film he was making?
Well, at that point, there was no script. And when I walked into Wells's home that morning, it was a Sunday, and we were told to show up at 9:30. And we did 27 setups that day, which is a heck of a lot. But it was mostly Peter Bogdanovich and me just doing comical things around the house. And then we also went out and did some of the scenes in the car. Some of that wound up in the film, the first day's shoot. When I'm asking questions in the car, some of that was just the very first day. But anyway, I said to Wells, is there a script? And he was sitting at a typewriter table and he pointed to a box under the table. He said, I've written, many pages of material on Jake Hannaford, and I know this man really well, and but there is no script per se. But I know a lot about him, and I'm going to improvise based on what I know of the material I've written. But by 1971, there was a script. When I showed up again, I was called to Hollywood, and we did a fair amount of shooting. For example, the scene early in the film when Hannaford's crew leaves the studio, that was done at producer's studio across the street from Paramount. It's a rental studio. That's where John Ford made The Informer, and Sam Fuller made Shot Corridor on the same soundstage where Ford made The Informer, which was Sam's favorite film. And it was it's been there for a long time, and they kind of upgraded it in recent years, but it was kind of a rundown rental studio at the time. But I'm losing track of your question. Oh, the bullfighting material.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. When I showed up, I said, are we going to Tijuana? I was told we were all going to drive down to Tijuana and shoot some scenes at the bullfight. And Gary Graver said, oh, no, we found out there's some kind of a law that means we can't take cameras across the border, so we're going to not do that. And Wells indicated he was just dropping the whole bullfight dimension of the film, which was quite a change because this project originated as a project called The Sacred Beasts. And Keith Baxter, who's great in Chinese at Midnight, plays Prince Hal. He was going to be in The Sacred Beasts, and he wrote a 40-page history of the Sacred Beast project, which he let me read, and hasn't been published, but it's very interesting. And Tony Perkins was going to be in it, and Jean Moreau, and Wells was going to play the lead of this Hemingway-esque director. He was going to be this Hemingway-esque director going around, following the bullfights with his entourage. And Hemingway was known for that. He wrote The Dangerous Summer, which was some Life magazine articles about following bullfights in 1959, and it was later published in book form. It's not as good as his classic Death in the Afternoon, his 1932 magnum opus on bullfighting, but he was going around with his cronies, and by then Hemingway was this world-famous celebrity. And in the 1966 documentary that the Maysles brothers did on Wells, sort of making a pitch for the funding of what became Other Side of the Wind, although it was still The Sacred Beasts, Wells described the people who follow the bullfights as seriously evil people, which I thought was a very interesting comment, because he actually did that himself. He was a bullfight aficionado for a long time, and he lived in Spain, and he eventually lost interest in bullfighting. He said, I've lost my afición, which is a word that means your passion for bullfighting. But he said, I've seen enough animals get slaughtered. He started to be repelled by that. But before that, he accepted the bullfight, and he thought, like Hemingway, it was a tragic spectacle, etc. But he thought the people who followed the bullfight were seriously evil. And I talked to him before we started filming Other Side of the Wind, and he made the point that he thought people who are spectators of violence are reprehensible because it's a voyeurism. He didn't like voyeurism, and he didn't like people who enjoy the spectacle of violence without any risk to themselves. And he was talking about Hannaford was somewhat like John Ford in the sense that Ford filmed World War II. He had his own unit, but he thought that Ford was sort of a voyeur compared to Hemingway, who was a war correspondent, but actually fired guns at the Germans. And I mean, he violated the Geneva Conventions. War correspondents are not supposed to be combatants. I mean, it's reprehensible. But Wells thought that that made Hemingway a more authentic character, that he was actually involved in combat and he wasn't a voyeur of combat. I think that's unfair to Ford. I mean, Ford risked his life in the Battle of Midway, for example, filming that, and got wounded and did all kinds of filming, and that's an important job that he had there. And Houston did the same. Well, San Pietro turns out to be kind of a fraudulent film. It's a marvelous called a documentary, but Houston arrived at this site of a battle after the battle had ended and recreated the battle with the soldiers who were there and had been in the battle and survived, and they told him what happened, and he did a great job of making it look real. There was a scholar who found the raw footage at the National Archives and wrote an article exposing the fact that this film was a reconstructed faux documentary. Houston never admitted that, but I was one of the people who was fooled by that. When we did the Houston AFI Award, we had Bill Malden there, who was the great editorial cartoonist, and he was the guy who drew the cartoon Willie and Joe for Stars and Stripes during World War II. He was a young Army cartoonist, and he was in Italy observing these battles as a cartoonist and drawing images. And we had him pay tribute to Houston's war service and war documentaries. And I had Bill say, unquestionably, San Pietro is the best film that came out of World War II. And today we would do it differently. I don't know how we would handle the fakery of the, I mean, we wouldn't lie about it. But at the time, I believed that this was a real documentary, and so did Bill Malden,
I understand that sometime soon after Citizen Kane, new management took over at RKO. Why were the new chiefs there so against Wells, and how did they treat him?
Well, I actually found an interview with Reginald Armour, who was George Schaefer's right-hand man. Schaefer was the head of production. Armour was very anti-Wells, very hostile to him. And he said the RKO board was hostile to Wells from the beginning when Schaefer signed him to a contract that, I mean, not all the board probably, but some of the board members were conservative, and they were hostile to Wells for a variety of reasons, just like a lot of people in Hollywood were. That here was this 24-year-old guy from the theater in New York who was an avant-garde theater director and a leftist, and why are we giving him this contract that's better than almost any other contract that's ever been given in Hollywood, other than somebody like Charlie Chaplin, who owned his own studio and paid for his films himself. He had the best deal ever. But Wells was given this great deal, and people thought he was an arty progressive, and so there was a lot of hostility. But Schaefer's position was precarious, and the whole Citizen Kane controversy with Hearst was damaging in different ways, and Kane didn't make money on its first run because of that. They were having trouble getting bookings and advertising, etc. And then Wells made Magnificent Ambersons with Schaefer's blessing, and both of the films went over budget, but not a lot. I think Ambersons went over budget by 14%. But the main problem was, they had this terrible preview in Pomona, and it was kind of a setup, I think, because it was a teenage Friday night audience who had come to see a Dorothy Lamour musical. It wasn't the kind of audience that would appreciate a somber study of change of American history, such as Ambersons. But they used that as an excuse to start cutting up the film and reshooting parts of it. And Wells was in South America by that time on U.S. government authority to make It's All True, which was RKO was involved financially on that project, but the government was also backing it, and he was out of their control to some extent down there. But they had a very hostile production manager named Lynn Shores who was sending back negative reports about Wells, and they were very racist messages. He used racist language, and Wells was portrayed by Shores as carousing and not doing his work sufficiently. Also, there was a conflict with RKO because Wells had a dual role in South America. He was supposed to be a goodwill ambassador for the United States. That's why the coordinator of Inter-American Affairs, Nelson Rockefeller, sent him down there, both to make this film that would be a kind of a good neighbor policy film, but also to do radio shows and meet with government officials and meet with various local people and spread the word, the anti-fascist policy of the United States. The main concern was the United States didn't want South America to go fascist. There were certain countries that might have gone fascist, and they were concerned about that. So the Wells had a dual role, but RKO didn't like it that Wells was taking time to do his government role, even though he was obligated to do that, and he was enthusiastic about it. So they used that against him, that you're taking time away from the film, and it was a very difficult situation for him down there. The reason he was fired, they claimed he went over budget on It's All True, but I discovered what I consider the smoking gun of his career, which is transcript of a telephone conversation between Phil Reisman, who was RKO's foreign manager, and Reginald Armour, who was George Schaefer's right-hand man. And this was April 27, 1942. And there's another conversation, a transcript that George Schaefer had called Reg Armour. And they were sending Phil Reisman down to Rio with the authority to terminate It's All True if he felt it should be terminated, or make a decision to let it continue. And this is quite remarkable. Reisman says to Armour, do you have the breakdown of actual costs to date, what the Mexican part of the picture costs to date? Has there been any budget set? And Armour says, no, it will be about $1.2 million altogether, but we don't want to talk to him about that. We don't want him to know. Now, this is really extraordinary. The studio says, we don't want the director to know what the budget of his movie is. And it was $1.2 million. I found other documents, RKO and government documents, that specify the budget was $1.2 million. And then Reisman says, someone must have told him, because when I was down there, he was telling everyone the picture would cost $1 million. And Wells said that even years later. He would say, I was sent down to make a picture for $1 million. That's what he thought the budget was, but it was really more than that. It was $1.2 million, and they didn't tell him, which is a sign of bad faith, obviously. And then Reisman goes on, it's going to be a documentary film and we'll never get it back. George is sending me down there with the right to shut the goddamn thing off if I want to and bring him home and take the loss right now. Then Armour says, I saw Magnificent Ambersons and Journey into Fear. They're both bad. Reisman, I would like you to send me a consensus on both pictures and put Citizen Kane in too, showing how much money we will lose. Armour says, we may break even on Kane, but that will be all. We'll be lucky if we do. Reisman says, if you talk to Moss at all, Jack Moss was Wells's business manager who was holding the fort at the studio for Mercury Productions. Armour says they're beginning to rat on Wells. He's referring to Moss and the other people in the Mercury office. Reisman says, in what way? Armour says, they say we told Wells to do so-and-so. Now we're being disloyal to him, but we'll do it. And they did turn on him, and Wells was very bitter about that they started cooperating and cutting Ambersons. And then Reisman says, he's a tough baby. He has done a magnificent job of selling himself to Nelson Rockefeller. And then Armour says there's no picture in it. In other words, we're getting a lot of footage that isn't any good. And then Armour says, George will lose his job out of this, which he did. Schaefer was deposed soon after this. And then Armour says, I think Orson wants to stay out of the country. He wants to duck military service. Reisman says, I think I could get the authorities to take him off our hands. That's pretty extraordinary, too. They were going to get him drafted if he didn't cooperate. Armour says, this picture will put us back in 77B, which means bankruptcy receivership, which RKO had been in and emerged from. Reisman says, do you really think so? Armour says, yes, I do, Phil. So they fired him for allegedly going over budget, but I found the actual RKO figures when Wells was doing his last shooting for the Jangaderos segment in the fishing village of Fortaleza. The costs up to that point were $752,548. So the budget is 1.2 million, which means that Wells was $447,452 under budget when he was fired for allegedly going over budget, which people keep repeating it. Let me underscore that again. He was $447,452 under budget when he was fired for going over budget. And they spread this lie, and Wells never realized how far under budget he was because he never knew that the budget was actually 1.2 million. So he was actually a pretty economical director, considering he had this sprawling, complicated project and he was working on it. He talked Reisman into letting him go to Fortaleza and shoot the Jangadero sequence with a silent camera, $10,000. That's all he had, and some film footage and a silent camera and a tiny crew. And miraculously, that part of the film has survived. And in the documentary that came out in 1993, It's All True, based on an unfinished film by Orson Welles that Paramount released. It's 48 minutes long. The Jangadero sequence is beautiful. It's a silent film with music. And Wells was apparently going to put some narration over it, but he never did. But that material got shot. But when one of the Jangaderos drowned in a terrible accident when they were filming, that's when they decided to pull the plug. But then Wells talked Reisman into letting him do the Jangaderos episode as a kind of a tribute to the fisherman who had died, whose name was Jacare. That was the nickname of Fitz. He was a national hero, and the country was understandably very upset that he had died making this film, a terrible disaster. Wells was distraught. But he stayed there and made this film tribute, and he didn't rush back to do what he could with Ambersons. He was horribly hurt by what they were doing up there. And he was supposed to be editing the film with Robert Wise by telephone and cable, which is cumbersome procedure. But Wise was going to be sent down there to work with him. And then they claimed that Wise couldn't get an airplane flight because of wartime restrictions, which may or may not have been true. It could have been an excuse, but it was wartime. It was hard to get airplane travel. And then when Wells finally went back to the States, it took him quite a while to get back. It took several airplane flights. And so that's the debacle that took place down there. And the film was unfinished, and Wells kept trying to finish it over the years. He kept trying to raise money and he was writing scripts, trying to, how do we make a film out of this material? And he could have done it, but he had some possible funding for it, and the funding evaporated, and so he had to give up on the project in 1946. It was when they finally found a lot of the footage, Fred Chandler was a studio archivist who found the material at Paramount, which had bought RKO. He called Wells and said, would you like to see it? And Wells said no. He was so traumatized by that he couldn't bring himself even to watch the material. But it exists at UCLA. It was given to UCLA Film and Television Archives. And the problem is that it's nitrate film, and so it's slowly rotting away. And I tried to help raise some money for it. I was vice president of the Los Angeles Film Critics Association, and we would make a profit on our award ceremony each year. And since we were a nonprofit group, we gave the money to various causes. One was UCLA preservation. We preserved a Todd Browning film, for example. And so I said, let's give, I think it was $9,000 to UCLA to, preserve some of It's All True, which means transfer it to safety film. So it's not just nitrate. And so we preserved 20 minutes of it, and it was kind of random what we preserved. We didn't know what we were going to see. It. A lot of it was not exceptional footage. It was tr training of bulls in the Mexican sequence that Norman Foster directed under Welles's supervision. And there's a lot of the Mexican sequence that hasn't been transferred, and people aren't as interested in that because it wasn't directed personally by Welles, but it's beautiful. It's a beautiful part of the film that we've seen. But there was one shot in the 20 minutes we restored that the editor of the documentary, the Paramount documentary, told me if he had seen that shot, he would have put it in the film. It was a long shot of the Jangaderos coming into the harbor in Rio, a spectacular long shot. But there's a lot of footage there that's just moldering away, and people have not come forward to preserve it. It's a sad situation.
Norman Foster was also doing Journey into Fear around the same time too, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was the director of Journey into Fear, and often with Welles projects, people kind of make up stories. And it was sort of assumed that Welles kind of told him what to do every step of the way, but Welles said that wasn't true. Really, Norman was directing itself, Journey into Fear. Welles got himself in a situation where he was trying to finish Ambersons, and he was producing Journey into Fear at the same time and playing a major role in that film. And it's a killer of a schedule, and he had to kind of accelerate the pace of both productions so he could get to Rio in time for the carnival. And Journey into Fear came out, and then Welles didn't like the way they edited it, so he somehow talked RKO into letting him revise Journey into Fear when he got back to Hollywood.
And they let him do that?
Yeah, they let him do that. Yeah, I don't know the whole story of that, but there are two different versions of that film out there. Norman Foster he's in The Other Side of the Wind. He's wonderful as Billy in the film. I think it's one of the best performances in that film. A marvelous,
yes, definitely is.
Tragicomic performance. He reminds me of Justice Shallow in Chimes of Midnight, who's a kind of a funny old guy. Norman he plays sort of the most loyal, dedicated member of Jake Hannaford's crew, and Jake abuses him for it. He's blaming the problems he's having raising money on poor Billy, who's doing his best. There's a scene early in the film. He's the guy who shows the studio boss, the kind of Robert Evans type character, some of the footage, and the studio boss is kind of appalled because Jake hasn't finished his film, and it's very avant-garde, etc. And it's a comical scene because Norman is trying to explain this footage to this guy, and Norman's character doesn't quite know what to say about it, and he's left holding the bag, and then Jake tears into him later at the party. He's really cruel to him.
I'd like to shift gears and ask you something else about the subject of your latest book, George Cukor. I don't know a lot about him, but I've seen a few interviews, and I get the impression that he was a little bit more optimistic and enthusiastic about the experimental and art house kind of films that were going on in the 60s and 70s, whereas some of the other guys his age were bemused or resentful about them.
Yeah, that's true.
He advocated for the transgender actress Holly Woodlawn to get an Oscar. Paul Morrissey's film Trash, and he hosted a party for Louis Buñuel in Hollywood. In your talks with him, did you get the impression that he was optimistic about the future and potential of the movies?
Yeah, he was different from the most of his peers. It's true. I interviewed a lot of those old directors at the time, and I made it my point when I was in Hollywood to get to know as many directors I admired as possible, and other people too, screenwriters, producers, actors. But almost all the old directors would rail against sex and violence in movies. You know, it had become, I mean, some films really became very excessively violent, and then the fact that, you know, hardcore porno films were showing in theaters was shocking to a lot of these old directors, etc. I mean, Hollywood had gone kind of in directions that they couldn't relate to at all. But I mean, there were some other directors, like, for example, Spielberg is a classical director. He's one of the last classical directors in the sense of, you know, you always know where you are in a Spielberg film. For example, the geography of the scene is always clear. I mean, that's something that was shattered in the late 60s. A lot of the young filmmakers were making films that were so fragmentary that you didn't know where you were. And sometimes that's good and sometimes it's not. And Wells was very aware of that theme, the stylistic variations. But Cukor really enjoyed the new freedom. He loved Paul Morrissey's films, and he was Lonesome Cowboys and other films. He was a big fan, and he speaks very um, enthusiastically about them in various interviews. And Morrissey became a friend of his. And but, you know, Cukor was gay, and he had to live in the closet his whole life, and he never actually totally came out of the closet. The closest he came in terms of admitting that he was gay was in an interview in The Advocate, a gay publication, 1982, the year before he died. And he gave an interview where it's quite clear that he's implicitly indicating he's gay, but he doesn't quite come out and say, I am gay, you know. As some people did later in their lives, they thought, okay, I want to live more frankly. Cukor never could quite do that. And he also was kind of admonishing his interviewers and the audience, the gay audience for The Advocate, that gay people needed to kind of avoid shocking and offending squares, basically, you know. And, you know, that's not exactly what The Advocate kind of expected people to say, because being in your face and open was what they were advocating. Cukor he believed in discretion. That was one of his favorite words. And he felt that James Whale, for example, who was a gay director, or a great director, did Frankenstein and other terrific films, Bride of Frankenstein. He was apparently much more open about it. There is that good movie, Gods and Monsters. It's kind of a takeoff on Whale's life. And Whale lived openly with a producer named David Lewis, and Cukor disapproved of them because evidently he thought they were too open about it. And he felt that hurt Whale's career. Whale stopped directing after a while, and it's a little mysterious why he stopped, but Cukor felt that his openness had contributed to that, whereas Cukor always was accepted by the establishment in Hollywood, and that was important to him as a professional director to keep viable, keep bankable, and he managed to do that. And he weathered all kinds of changes in Hollywood from the 1929 to 1982. I mean, it's a long, long career. And a lot of styles changed and regimes changed, and he kept going. And he had some problems later in his career of getting work, but he would take jobs that were kind of interestingly offbeat. For example, Justine is a film that he came into as the previous director had been fired, Joseph Strick, who was a terrible director. Truffaut once was asked, more or less, who you think the world's worst director is, and he said Joseph Strick. And he said, usually it's hard to differentiate between bad directors, but he said Strick makes it easy because he films the world's greatest literary masterpieces and screws them up, basically. I'm paraphrasing, but he made films of Ulysses and Portrait of the Artist as a young man and other classic literary works. But he was fired from Justine. He had been filming in Africa, and they brought him the production back, And Cukor was hired with 1 week's notice to take over this film, which is really tough, especially when, I think it's something like 20% of the film had to be Strix footage that he shot in Africa because they didn't want to go back to Africa. So Cukor had to create Alexandria, Egypt in 1936 in the studio with the help of a great, production designer and costumer and great cameraman, Leon Shamroy, who did a magnificent job of photography on that film. And Cukor did a wonderful job. I like Justine a lot, even though there's some problems with it. Parts of the film are clunky because of the location work is not great. And Anuka May was one of the few actresses Cukor really despised. He said she was a blank, boring wall and didn't care. She tried to walk off the film at one point, and they had to threaten to sue her to keep her from leaving, it would have ruined her career if she had done that. But she's actually a great camera subject. I mean, her face is fascinating, and Leon Shamroy was a great photographer of women, and Justine is this enigmatic character who is opaque, but it kind of works for the film. But anyway, he did some marvelous work in that film, and it starts off with transvestite male dancers, belly dancers, in a kind of a louche Alexandria nightclub, and they're dancing with Anna Karina, who's wonderful in the film. Cukor loved Anna Karina. They had a great relationship, and Dirk Bogarde was somebody else he was very close to, and they're both great in the film. And she's a belly dancer, but she's dancing with guys who are in drag, and so Cukor, you could tell that he loved the freedom that he was given with Justine to do all kinds of things that he had never been able to do before. And then he did Travels with My Aunt, which is a really beautiful, lavish, stylized film that has some tremendous flashbacks of Maggie Smith in her real age. And she was in her 30s at the time, but she plays an old lady in the framing story of the film. And her makeup is very artificial, and her performance is very campy, and you kind of have to accept that. I kind of wished when I first saw that film that she had played it a little more, a little more restrained way. But now I just kind of go along with Cukor loved camp humor to some extent. And if you read Susan Sontag's famous essay on camp, you see a lot of that helps explain what he was doing in Travels with My Aunt. I quote that in the book, and my book, George Cukor's People. And Sylvia Scarlett draws from the camp sensibility way back in the 1930s, and the idea of camp existed before that, and but it was very esoteric at the time. And the audience in 1935 who saw Sylvia Scarlett didn't know what to make of this bizarre film. Today we love it; it's a wonderful movie. But in '72, camp had become kind of in, and but Travels with My Aunt still didn't get the appreciation it deserved. But boy, it is a beautiful film on the big screen. The photography is stunning, and Cukor's visual style became more elaborate and more rich as time went on, starting pretty much with A Star is Born, which is, I think, his greatest film. And that is a feast for the eyes as well. Really wonderful. And he was so generous about sharing credit, and he loved collaboration, that I asked him about his visual style becoming more elaborate. And he said, well, it's because I started working with Gene Allen, my production designer, art director. And how many directors would say that? I mean, giving a lot of credit to his art director. He became one of his closest collaborators, and Gene Allen would do some second unit directing, and he would be on the set, and Cukor, he admitted when he started directing, he didn't know much about the camera, but he said, I learned pretty fast. And, you could tell from 1932 onward that he's very adept with visual style, but he relied heavily on art directors and costumers and people like that. And Gene Allen would be with him on the set and sometimes suggest shots, and he didn't feel that was usurping his prerogative as a director. That's the way collaborative filmmaking works. Wells was as strong a director, as anybody. And he worked very closely with Gary Graver, was this young cameraman who deeply influenced the visual style of Other Side of the Wind. And sometimes Gary even went off and did some scenes by himself. One time, Orson wanted to watch some TV show. I forget what it was. And actually, I think it was Shot Corridor was on TV, and he wanted to watch that. And he let Gary direct some of the party scenes. And, he also, sometimes the film within the film, he would send Gary and Oya off to shoot scenes on their own, and it's kind of like, surprise me. Like, I want to see what you guys come up with. And, that's an interesting way to work on film, as long as you control the whole thing. And Cukor controlled the whole thing. But he worked closely with great cameramen and art directors and other people like that.
You mentioned Spielberg a moment ago. What were your thoughts on the Fabelmans, including the little depiction of John Ford as played by David Lynch?
Oh, well, I just love that. And, most people just, even if they don't like the Fabelmans or whatever, they love that sequence. It's so great. Wonderful way to end the movie, where this young guy finally he's breaking into Hollywood, and he gets to meet the greatest director of all time, who kind of gives him a hard time, but sort of gives him his blessing in a perverse way, and says good luck to you at the end of the film. And I spent an hour with John Ford in 1970. I interviewed him for my critical study I was doing with Mike Wellington. John Ford and Spielberg only had a couple minutes. That's all Ford said he would give him, and it gives him this memorable lesson in composition. It's terrific. But I think that scene really captures what it was like to be in Ford's presence when he was old and in his office, and very crusty and tough to deal with. He was kind of sarcastic and playing, being difficult and being obscure, etc. And I was stubborn after a while. I was kind of intimidated by Ford and in awe of him. It was my first interview in Hollywood. Can you imagine? I was 23, and John Ford. It was the last day of his career. He retired in the course of our interview. He announced his retirement. I was stunned. And I didn't quite understand. All through my hour with him, he kept sort of asking his secretary, has the gentleman from Italy called? Has the man from Italy called yet? And I didn't know what he was talking about. And many years later, when I was doing the biography, I went through Ford's papers, which are surprisingly rich collection at Indiana University in Bloomington. And I looked at the correspondence for that period and realized what he was talking about. There was an Italian producer who was considering making a film with Ford in Italy. Woody Strode, his actor friend, had become a star of Italian westerns, like Clint Eastwood had done, and Lee Van Cleef. And Woody Strode was trying to get Ford a job directing in an Italian western, spaghetti western, and Ford was going to do it. And he was waiting for the call from Italy, and he was realizing in the course of the hour I spent with him, the call was not going to come through. That was the end of his career, and he basically said, I apologize for asking some dumb questions, stupid questions. And he said, well, it isn't that, but all you people, you all ask the same questions, and I don't know how to answer them. And he said, I'm just a hard-nosed, hard-working, there was a long pause. He said, ex-director, and I'm trying to retire gracefully. And that pause was so moving to me, that he's an ex-director, but with Spielberg, it was all very condensed and focused, but that's good for film to have a 2-minute scene that is really terrific. I thought The Fabelmans is a really good film, and I wrote a piece for Slant magazine. They asked me as a biographer of Spielberg to comment on the film and how close it was to the real story. And it is somewhat fictionalized. It's kind of like Truffaut's 400 Blows, which is his autobiographical film. To me, the best personal autobiographical film ever done is The 400 Blows. But, in that film, he's called Antoine Doinel, and it's set in 1958, 59, not, when Truffaut's childhood was during World War II. And it would have been a very different film if he had filmed it exactly the way his childhood childhood was. When he did The Last Metro, he said it in that period, but it was about stage actors, a very good film. But he showed what it was like to live under Nazi occupation. But it would have been a very different film, you know, young boy living under Nazi occupation, etc. But Truffaut wanted to fictionalize it partly because his parents were still living. And his parents were very upset by the film anyway, because it's pretty scathing and pretty accurate. And he actually gave a press conference under duress and said not autobiographical. My parents were not like that at all. I mean, it's a completely false statement, you know. But I think Spielberg, he wanted some aesthetic distance. His parents had both died, and he said that they both encouraged him to make that film. But he found it hard to make because it reveals that secret about his mother falling in love with another man. And I came to that story when I did my research on Spielberg for my biography back in the 90s. I found that out, that the divorce was supposedly the fault of his father Arnold, because he was a workaholic, and Stephen's mother Leah felt neglected and restless, etc. And that was the story. Arnold took the blame for it, but people started telling me, well, it's more complicated than that. He was a workaholic, and he admitted that to me. I had a great interview with him. He's a wonderful man. But Leah fell in love with Bernie Adler, who was Arnold's best friend. He was a good friend of the family, and they were computer engineers together. And it's like you see in the film, Bernie was around a lot, and he was kind of like an uncle, and Leah fell in love with him, and he was more her, what she needed, kind of a looser guy, etc. And that's what broke up the family. But I didn't know the incident where young Stephen discovered it through his work as a filmmaker, which is a powerful scene in the film when he's editing the footage and he realizes what's going on. He sees this moment of intimacy between his mother and this guy, and a terrific scene. And he suddenly goes backward like this, and in his chair, he's kind of viscerally thrown by it. And I didn't know that part of the story, you know. But I knew that he blamed his mother at the time, and he was angry at his mother. I found this out from the guy who was his closest friend at the time, told me all about that. And Stephen was mad at his mother, and you know, it was a complicated story. I had to be somewhat discreet in telling that in the book because they were all alive. But Stephen didn't want his mother to talk to me, which is interesting. I thought it was just because, you know, your mother knows all the bad stories about you, you know, what you have under your bed. And Stephen had a parakeet. I mean, literally a parakeet in his room that would shit all over the room and stuff. I thought she would tell stories about that, but he probably thought that she might reveal this secret that he had been keeping for many years and was considering making a movie about. Maybe that's why he told his mother not to talk to me. He was actually kind of helpful. He wouldn't talk to me for the book. His PR guy, Marvin Levy, said, Stephen is thinking of writing an autobiography at some point, and he's saving his stories for his autobiography, but he's not going to interfere with you, which I appreciated. After my Capra book, where the Capra family members, some of them interfered with my book, and Capra himself was cooperative but difficult. But Stephen wouldn't talk to me. But when his office was called by people, they, you know, said McBRIDE called and asked me to do an interview. Is it okay with you? They told people I was kosher, which was very nice and helpful. And most people, you know, it helped me get interviews. I interviewed 327 people. There were some people who wouldn't talk, who just didn't respond usually to my requests. Although some people, Lew Wasserman, I wrote him a letter, you know, the most powerful man in Hollywood, the head of MCA, and helped get Stephen's career going. He wrote back a very courteous letter and said, well, thank you for your request, but I just don't give interviews. Sorry. And then I happened to be talking to a guy who was writing a biography of Jimmy Stewart, who had been a client of Lew Wasserman. And he said, oh, I've got an interview with Lew Wasserman coming up. He's going to talk to me about Jimmy Stewart. So I mean, that letter was a lie. But Wasserman just didn't want to talk about Spielberg, so that
Mhm.
happened. I got some of those reactions too. But so if people want to look up my article on the Fabelmans, you'll see some things that he left out a lot of stuff that I wish was in there. But it's a long movie; you can't put everything in a film. And the one thing I thought is strange. In Phoenix, he had some anti-Semitic incidents against him, and he doesn't indicate that in the film. And he
Mhm.
shows the filming of Escape to Nowhere, his World War II film, and he shows his alter ego Sammy directing this tall jock, John Wayne-looking guy. And there's a wonderful scene where he's kind of learning how to direct an actor and getting a good performance out of this kid who's not really an actor. And what Stephen did was there was a bully who was giving him a hard time and who was anti-Semitic, and he neutralized him by putting him in the film where he could boss him around, which I thought was a wonderful way to handle your bully, you know. And he did that kind of thing. That would have been terrific to have in the film. And I could never find out exactly who the bully was. Everybody was kind of protective, and nobody would tell me. But I interviewed the guy who played that role in Escape to Nowhere, and he gave me a good interview. But it wasn't just suddenly in Saratoga, California, Northern California, where Stevens said I only had, I think he says in interviews, only two people ever harassed me with anti-Semitic remarks, and that's not true. I mean, he got some heat back in Phoenix, and he got more heat up in Saratoga, and it wasn't just two guys. And he was very bitter about the whole experience in Saratoga. Like the school asked him to contribute some money, and he said, "I'll never give a penny to that school." And I went to their graduation 30th reunion, and they all hoped he would show up. Of course, he wouldn't show up, but I was there.
Mhm.
Um, so there are some things that he left out and oversimplified, but that's kind of what happens when you fictionalize your own life or make a kind of semi-fiction
Yeah.
out of your life.
Okay. One last thing I'd like to ask you. I know you were able to visit the set of Family Plot, Hitchcock's final film. What were your takeaways from that? Did you get to speak to him at all?
Well, I've got a picture I found of me and Hitchcock. There's on the Family Plot DVD, there's a documentary on it, and I noticed, oh, there I am. Hitchcock is walking past with his assistant director, Howard Kazanjian, and it was this young guy. I was very impressed by him. And I'm in the background, and I froze the frame. I got a still of me and Hitchcock and Howard Kazanjian.
Hmm.
Uh, I was on the set for 3 days, and one of the things I did was I went on the location of a church on Wilshire Boulevard in LA where they filmed the bishop who was being kidnapped. He was being taken out the side door of the church, and I watched them take out this bishop and put him in a car and drive off, and that's where I got the little shot. He filmed the interior of the cathedral in San Francisco because the story is supposedly taking place in San Francisco. But I was on the set at Universal watching him shoot and interviewed him and interviewed Bruce Dern, and it was really fascinating. The big discovery I made was I caught Hitchcock improvising,
Hmm.
and I was in the garage scene where Barbara Harris and she's in the scene, and William Devane and Karen Black, and they have the kidnapped bishop, and he starts moving around, and they inject him with a needle. And I was standing right next to Hitchcock and his DP, Leonard South, and Hitchcock started making up shots. And he got very excited about this business with jabbing the bishop with a needle. And he invented, I think, 7 shots. And I wrote down exactly what he said, I mean, verbatim, where he was making a whole montage sequence out of it, like, classic Hitchcock, very elaborate montage when some violent thing would happen. He was a master at breaking it down into components so that it would all come together. And he could see it in his head. He was great at that. So I put that in my article on the shooting. And I also talked about how he worked with the actors, and he was, uh, you know, um, Well, I talked to Bill Crone, who wrote the book Hitchcock at Work, and Bill said he was inspired to do the book by my article on the film because I pointed out that Hitchcock didn't just shoot the storyboards. Like he told Truffaut, you know, I believe this, and everybody else believed it. In Truffaut's book, Hitchcock says, you know, I'm actually bored when I shoot a film because I've already shot it in my head, you know, and I have all the storyboards, and I just go in and just shoot what I've planned out in the office. And well, that was not really true. Um, Bill went into Hitchcock's papers at the Academy Library, and I've looked at those papers myself, but not as thoroughly as Bill did. And Bill found that Hitchcock worked pretty much like most directors. What he storyboarded, according to Bill, was action scenes and special effects scenes. It really had to be broken down ahead of time. Like the scene, there's a bravura action sequence in Family Plot where there's an out of control car going down a mountain road. That was all storyboarded and carefully planned, you know. But he said Bill said when Hitchcock directed scenes of people talking or interacting, he would shoot it like any director would, where you'd, you know, Hitchcock. Well, I'll tell you a great story. Joan Darling, who was an actress who is wonderful in a Spielberg TV show called Par for the Course, which is his favorite episodic TV show. Clu Gallagher plays a golfer dying of cancer, and she plays his wife, and she's just wonderful. There's a great scene when he dies, and she has to call her mother on the telephone. It's terrific. And Joan Darling became a good director. She was one of the first women directors in Hollywood in the 70s, and she directed one of the best Amazing Stories episodes called What If, that Spielberg's sister Anne Spielberg wrote that. It's just powerful. But she also directed the feature First Love, and I interviewed Joan Darling for that. And we got along so well that when I was interviewing her about First Love, she said, "Were we married in an earlier life?" That's one of my favorite comments from an interview subject. But I interviewed her about Spielberg, and she said when she was going to direct The Amazing Stories for Spielberg, she called him and said, "Stephen, I have some questions. Maybe you could help me about directing." He said, "Okay. Well, tell me what are some hints or suggestions?" And he said, "Well, don't shoot a lot of scenes of people getting in and out of cars." And she said, "Okay." And he said, "Don't shoot a lot of scenes of people walking upstairs and into houses and stuff, you know, like when you shoot a scene of somebody pulling up in a car, just cut from the car pulling up to the guy going in the door, and don't shoot the whole, you know." And she said, "Okay, that's good advice." And she said, "What else?" And he said, get a good pair of shoes." And she said, "Oh, okay." And he said, "Sit down a lot because, you know, you get tired making a film. Sit down, you know." And she said, "That's fine." And then she said to me, she said, "You know, I literally said to Stephen, in 30 years, when the biographers come around asking me questions about this conversation, am I going to have to say that's all you told me? You know, get a good pair of shoes and sit down a lot." And he said, "Well, what do you want to know?" And she said, "How do you know where to put the camera?" And that's a great question, right? And he said, "Okay." He said, "Watch where you're standing when you do the rehearsal. That's where you should put the camera." And I tell this to students. That's a really profound observation about directing, I think. Watch where you're standing when you're watching the rehearsal. And that's what most directors do. And Hitchcock did that. I saw him. What you do is you get the actors on the set, and you know, most directors kind of let the actors, I mean, Ford did this, he let the actors kind of play the scene, and he watched them, and he kind of let them play it the way they thought it should be played, and then he would start making changes. And Hitchcock did that too. He started saying, "No, you know, don't cross over here, cross over there, and get up here and stand there and say this and whatever, and move things around, move the props around, move the furniture." But basically you're giving some freedom to the actors. You know, it wasn't as rigid as it sounds in the Truffaut book, which is a wonderful book in so many ways. But I must say that as a aspiring filmmaker in the 60s, I was damaged by that book, even though it's the book that taught me the most about filmmaking of all books I've ever read. I thought you had to storyboard everything. And so when I directed my amateur films in Wisconsin, I storyboarded the whole thing for like I made 6 films, and I think 5 of them I did complete storyboards, and I directed the actors like they were puppets. I knew exactly where they were going to stand and move and what direction they were going to look. And I noticed that well, I did a romantic comedy with Mike Wilmington and Carolyn Purdy Gordon, who was married later to Stuart Gordon, the director, and it's called Close But No Cigar. And Mike was great to work with. He would do anything I wanted pretty much. Although one time I asked him to run along the edge of a big building project. There was this giant hole there, and he said, "Well, I'm not going to do that. It looks dangerous." And so I got pissed off and I just ran around the edge of the thing myself, said, "It's easy, do it." And then he did it. But he pretty much would do whatever I wanted. And he was very professional. But Carolyn was extremely unprofessional, and she would come and she would work for like 30 minutes or an hour and then say, "I've got to go." And so Mike and it took 6 months to make this little film. Um, but I realized when the film was shown finally, she came to me and said, "Geez, I didn't realize I'm really good in this film, and it's a good film. Thank you very much. I didn't understand what I was doing when I was shooting it." And I was so mad at her at that point, I didn't really say much. But, I learned a lesson from that. The actors have to be having a good time when they're making a film. And if they feel like they're just puppets of the director, they don't like it.
Mm.
And, Mike kind of went along with it, but kind of brought his personality to it. But she was just pissed off all the way through. And it was my fault because I didn't really give her any freedom. So the 6th film I didn't storyboard it, and I did it in a kind of loose style where I showed up on the set and figured out what to do, and it's a much better film.
Mm.
So that's what the lesson I take from watching Hitchcock shoot Family Plot. In Bill's book, Hitchcock at Work, I highly recommend it. It has all kinds of inside stuff on every Hitchcock film and how he shot important sequences. It's just full of lore and information. And Hitchcock's papers are voluminous. And for example, they have story conferences where he would record his conferences with writers and his conferences with his visual people. And you could read the transcripts of all these things. You know exactly how they planned all these scenes. And it's fascinating. But there's nothing like watching the director shoot, and I had that wonderful experience of being able to do it. And it was hard to get on that set. I called and they said no. And I told my editor, Tom Pryor, who knew Hitchcock well, and I said, "Geez, I'd love to go on that set." And he said, "I'll call Hitch." And so he called Hitchcock, and Tom worked it out so I could go visit the set. And Hitchcock was very nice. And I got to see him and Bruce Dern sitting in chairs together, laughing, and they had similar senses of humor. They were both very bawdy and funny and kind of juvenile in a way. It was right at the time when Jaws had just come out and was making a fortune. And Hitchcock wouldn't let Spielberg visit the set of Family Plot. And he threw Spielberg off the set of Torn Curtain.
Mm.
He snuck on the set of Torn Curtain, and when they saw him, they threw him off. But he wouldn't let him come on the set. I guess he was jealous of this young director. But Hitchcock was one of the biggest stockholders of MCA, so he was making a fortune from Jaws. So I noticed, I saw that every early afternoon, somebody would come on the set and give Hitchcock the daily box office figures for Jaws.
Mm.
And one time, Bruce Dern and Hitchcock were sitting there, and there was a set of a San Francisco alley with a garage. It was supposed to be a night scene, and Hitchcock said, "We need a wind machine to blow leaves, make it look like it's really happening." And then they said, one of them said, "We should put some graffiti on the wall of that garage." And Bruce Dern suggested putting the Jaws logo there. I mean, he was being facetious, the big mouth of the shark.
Mm.
And they were laughing about that. And Hitchcock said, "No, Bruce, I know what we should write there. Fuck MCA." That kind of thing. So it was fun. They were having fun. Hitchcock loved Bruce Dern and Barbara Harris. They're both quirky, modern actors who kind of had great senses of humor, and they were good at improvising too. And there's I don't know what directors said it, but planned improvisation is what some director called it. I mean, you know, if you know, I think what Hitchcock did, some actors have said he created a space for the actors to inhabit, and they kind of knew basically what was happening in the scene, but they had a certain amount of freedom within that, and that was a good combination, actors said. And there's so many people in Hitchcock films who are really great, you know, like Teresa Wright in Shadow of a Doubt. Wow. I mean, Truffaut was a huge fan of that performance, and she was a young actress. And Andrew Sarris had a great comment on that. He said, she's scarcely bearable in Mrs. Miniver, but almost glorious in Shadow of a Doubt.
Mm.
I would take the word almost out. She is glorious in Shadow of a Doubt. And Mrs. Miniver, I've never been able to get through. It's tedious film. So that's the difference between a rigid director like Weiler and a looser director like Hitchcock. Brought out a great performance in that young actress.
Okay. Well, Joseph McBride, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you very much, Michael. It's been wonderful talking to you, and we've sure covered a lot of interesting areas of Wells and other directors. I appreciate it.
Yes. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.